The sun hung low over the Texas prairie that afternoon, when Samuel Hart guided his weathered pickup truck down the dusty road toward the old Henderson place, and the weight in his chest had been there for 3 days now, ever since he'd gotten the call about Martha Henderson passing away at the county hospital with no family to claim her body and no money for a proper burial. Samuel was 62 years old, and he'd been ranching these lands for 40 years, and in all that time he'd learned that some debts couldn't be measured in dollars and cents, and Martha Henderson had been his third-grade teacher back in 1967 when he was just a scared little boy whose mama had run off and whose daddy drank too much. He remembered how Mrs. Henderson would pack an extra sandwich in her lunch pail and how she'd always seem to drop it accidentally near his desk, and how she'd say, "Oh, Samuel, would you mind eating that for me before it goes to waste?" And her eyes would be so kind that he'd take it even though his pride burned like fire in his throat. Now here he was driving out to dig a grave on her property, because the county was going to bury her in the pauper's field, and Samuel Hart couldn't let that happen to the woman who'd taught him that kindness was the only currency that really mattered in this world. The Henderson house stood alone against the evening sky, and paint peeled from its wooden sides like old skin, and the porch sagged in the middle where countless feet had walked over the decades, and Samuel climbed out of his truck and pulled his shovel from the bed and walked toward the small family cemetery on the hill behind the house where Martha's husband Thomas had been buried 15 years ago. The ground was hard and dry, and Samuel began to dig as the sun painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, and he thought about all the years that had passed, and all the children Martha had taught, and how she'd never had children of her own. But she'd mothered half the town in one way or another. He was maybe 2 feet down when he heard the voice. "Don't dig that grave yet." Samuel straightened up and turned around, and there stood Elena Rodriguez, and she was maybe 55 with silver threading through her dark hair, and she was breathing hard like she'd been running, and her face was flushed. "Elena," Samuel said, and wiped his brow with his sleeve. "What are you doing out here?" "I heard what you were doing," she said, and walked closer. "I heard you. We're burying Mrs. Henderson, and I came to help, but Samuel, we can't bury her yet." "The funeral's tomorrow morning," Samuel said gently. "I need to have this ready." "I know, but there's something you need to see first," Elena said, and her voice cracked. "Something in the house, and I think it changes everything." Samuel stuck his shovel in the dirt and followed Elena down the hill and across the yard and up onto that sagging porch, and the front door wasn't locked, because Martha Henderson had never locked her doors and said that a locked door was just a sign that you'd stop trusting in the basic goodness of people. Inside the house smelled like lavender, and old books and dust motes danced in the slanting sunlight that came through the windows, and Elena led him to the dining room where the table was covered with papers and photographs and old letters tied with ribbon. "I came by yesterday to pay my respects," Elena explained. "And I found all this, and Samuel, there are letters here, addressed to people all over town, and there are instructions, and there are things we need to know." Samuel picked up one of the letters, and it was addressed to him in Martha's careful handwriting, and his hands shook as he opened it and began to read. "Dear Samuel," it said, "if you're reading this, then I've gone on ahead, and I hope you'll forgive an old woman for one last lesson, and the lesson is this: we are all connected in ways we never fully understand, and the kindness we show each other echoes through time like ripples in a pond." He read on and learned that Martha had been setting aside small amounts of money for years, and not much because she'd never had much but enough, and she'd created a fund to help children in the county who needed school supplies or shoes or winter coats, and she'd done it all quietly without ever putting her name on anything. But there was more, and Elena handed him another letter, and this one was addressed to the whole town. Martha Henderson had left her house and property to be turned into a community center, and she'd left instructions for how it should be done, and how it should be a place where people could gather, and where children could play, and where loneliness could be defeated by the simple act of coming together. Samuel sat down heavily in one of Martha's old chairs, and he felt tears burning in his eyes. "There's more," Elena said softly, and handed him a small leather journal. She kept track of every student she ever taught, and what became of them, and Samuel, she was so proud of all of you. He opened the journal with trembling fingers, and there was his name, and next to it she'd written, "Good man and kind heart, and loved by his family, and I knew he would be all right. And there were hundreds of other names and hundreds of other notes, and Martha Henderson had carried all of them in her heart for all these years. We can't just bury her and forget, Elena said. We need to honor what she wanted, and we need to tell people, and we need to make sure her last lesson isn't wasted. Samuel nodded and wiped his eyes and stood up. You're right, he said. We'll postpone the burial, and we'll get the word out, and we'll do this proper. And that's what they did over the next 3 days. The story spread through town like wildfire, and people Samuel hadn't seen in years started showing up at the Henderson place, and they came with stories and memories and photographs, and many of them came with tears. Robert Chen, who was now a doctor in Houston, drove 5 hours when he heard the news, and he remembered how Mrs. Henderson had encouraged him when other teachers had dismissed him, and how she'd told him that being different was a strength, not a weakness. Margaret Williams came with her 3 grown daughters, and she told them how Mrs. Henderson had secretly paid for her books one year when her family couldn't afford them, and how that act of kindness had allowed her to stay in school and eventually become the first person in her family to graduate. James Patterson, who'd been the troubled kid everyone had given up on, stood in Martha's classroom turned living room and told how she'd visited him in juvenile detention when he was 16, and how she'd looked at him with those kind eyes and said, "This isn't who you are, and I know the real you is still in there waiting to come out." The stories kept coming, and each one was a testament to a life lived in service to others. And Samuel Hart stood in the middle of it all and marveled at how one woman with not much money and no family of her own had built a family that numbered in the hundreds. On the 4th day they held the funeral, and the little cemetery on the hill couldn't hold all the people who came, and they spilled down the hillside and across the yard and onto the road, and Father Miguel from St. Anthony's gave a beautiful homily about how we measure a life, not by what we accumulate, but by what we give away. Samuel had asked if he could say a few words, and when the time came, he stood beside the simple pine casket that the town had collectively paid for, and he looked out at all those faces. "Mrs. Henderson taught me to read," he began, and his voice was rough with emotion. "But more than that, she taught me that one person can make a difference, and that kindness costs nothing, but means everything. And standing here today, seeing all of you, I realize that she's taught us one final lesson." He paused and looked at the casket. "She's taught us that we don't really die as long as we live on in the hearts of the people we've touched. And she's taught us that the best memorial isn't made of stone, but of the lives we continue to change, and the kindness we continue to show." There wasn't a dry eye on that hillside. After they lowered Martha Henderson into the ground beside her husband, and after the last prayers were said and the last handfuls of earth were thrown, people didn't leave, and instead they gathered in small groups and talked about what to do next. Elena took charge of organizing the community center project, and Robert Chen pledged a significant donation to get it started, and Margaret Williams volunteered to run the scholarship fund that Martha had begun. Within 6 months, the Henderson Community Center opened its doors, and the old house had been lovingly restored, and the rooms that had once held Martha's modest possessions now held life and laughter and purpose. There was a library in what had been her bedroom, and a computer lab where her living room had been, and a kitchen where people could learn to cook and share meals together, and in the dining room where Samuel and Elena had first found Martha's letters, there was now a wall covered with photographs of all her students over the years. Samuel Hart visited often, and he'd bring his grandchildren and tell them stories about the woman who'd taught him that the best investment you could make was in another human being. One afternoon in early spring, almost a year after Martha's death, Samuel stood on the porch of the community center and watched children playing in the yard, and he thought about that day when he'd been digging her grave, and how Elena's voice had stopped him. "Don't dig that grave yet," she'd said, and in a way they never had, because Martha Henderson wasn't in that cemetery on the hill, and she was here in this place, and in these children, and in every act of kindness that rippled out from the lessons she'd taught Elena. "Came out and stood beside him, she'd be happy," Elena said. "She would." Samuel agreed. They stood in comfortable silence for a while, and then Samuel said, "You know, I was so focused on giving her a proper B.